this morning. Final reading this morning is from Mark's Gospel. As a congregation, we've been going through Mark's Gospel this last almost a year, 9 months or so. We've been going through it. The bad thing about being outside is you fight with motorcycles and jetliners flying down the runway here. It's all good. We've been going through Mark's Gospel as a congregation, and we are near the end of that. We're in Mark chapter 14 this week. We're picking up this week at Mark chapter 14, verse 53. If you happen to have a Bible with you, you want to follow along, that's where we are. I'm going to read all the way through the end of chapter 14 to verse 72. And now the word of the Lord. And they led Jesus to the high priest. And all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes came together. And Peter had followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. And he was sitting with the guards and warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. And some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy the temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another, not made with hands.' Yet even about this their testimony did not agree. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, 'Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?' But he remained silent and made no answer. Again the high priest asked him, 'Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?' And Jesus said, 'I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven.' And the high priest tore his garments and said, 'What further witness do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision?' And they all condemned him as deserving death. And some began to spit on him and to cover his face and to strike him, saying to him, 'Prophecy.' And the guards received him with blows. And as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came, and seeing Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, 'You also were with the Nazarene Jesus.' But he denied it, saying, 'I neither know nor understand what you mean.' And he went out into the gateway, and the rooster crowed, and the servant girls saw him and began again to say to the bystanders, 'This man is one of them.' But again he denied it. And after a little while, the bystanders again said to Peter, 'Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean.' But he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, 'I do not know this man of whom you speak.' And immediately the rooster crowed a second time. And Peter remembered how Jesus had said to him, 'Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times.' And he broke down and wept." This is the word of the Lord. Well, we all stand outside here. One of our first services during COVID-19 was outside because of all the uncertainty about the future. And so I ask you this morning, how confident are you about the future? How confident are you about the future of the economy, maybe your own job? How confident are you about the future of your health, your retirement, the remainder of your kid's school year, your relationships? How confident are you about the future of our government and nation with these elections coming up? How confident are you about what life looks like after coronavirus? There's so much we don't know about the future. There's so much we don't know about today. There's so much we don't know about tomorrow. There's so much we don't know about next week or next year. I mean, who would have guessed a year ago today that we'd be in a pandemic right now in our country? None of us would have guessed that. If you do, you're probably a prophet. You probably should be up here preaching this morning. You know, your confidence in the future affects how you live in the present. Your confidence in the future affects how you live in the present. If you don't believe it, did anyone have trouble buying toilet paper and paper towels when the pandemic started? Right? If everyone thought the coronavirus was going to be over in like a week, we wouldn't have that problem, would we? Everything would have been all good. We wouldn't have a worldwide toilet paper shortage. But no one knew. No one knew when it would be over. No one knew what the future held. And so there was panic over toilet paper and paper towels of all things. Who would have guessed it? Your confidence in the future does affect how you live in the present. And And that stands out in our text from Mark's gospel this morning as you look at two different hopes for the future. The first hope is an unreliable hope for the future. An unreliable hope for the future. Let's start with the religious leaders in our passage. These guys were living large, if you don't know. They were in charge of extremely prosperous and an extremely huge, mighty institution. And not only did they hold all the power in their institution, they also had a lot of sway in the Roman government that was over them. You see, the Romans actually charged these religious leaders with keeping the peace in what was largely a Jewish city, Jerusalem, and a Jewish area, Judah and Israel. And if the peace wasn't kept, then not only would the Jews have a problem, would the religious leaders have a problem with their power, but the Romans, the Roman government themselves would have a problem with power. So as much as the Romans hated the religious leaders and the Jewish people hated the Romans, those in authority on both sides needed each other to preserve their institutions and their power. And together, the religious leaders and the Roman governor, whose name was Pontius Pilate, we'll hear more about him next week, had all the power and control. All of it was theirs. And it was all working out great until Jesus confronted them. He confronted their corrupt institution and their phony religion, and he won the favor of all the people. But that threatened those leaders' existence. The future for the religious leaders looked very certain in their own minds, but Jesus' rising popularity put all that into question. So they've been working on a way, as we've seen in Mark's gospel, to get rid of Jesus. And they were going to arrest him, which they did under the cover of darkness, and they put together a legal case for his execution under their law, which would be carried out by the Romans because they were not able to carry out the death penalty. They needed the Roman government to execute that sentence for them. And after arresting Jesus just after midnight, they bring him to verse 53, the residence of the high priest, who was met there by all the religious leaders, the chief priests, the elders, the scribes that you read about in our passage. And this was the equivalent of the religious court, of the Supreme Court of their day. And they're all meeting at the Chief Justice's house. Like if our Supreme Court met at the Chief Justice's house in the middle of the night, do you think there might be an uproar over that if the people knew? Well, this is what's going on. It's a very clandestine, urgent trial. And these religious leaders were beginning to act kind of crazy because they were so desperate because they believed that killing Jesus was going to preserve their institution and their power and their control. This was all about preserving their institution, all about self-preservation, all about protecting their future, what they were hoping in, what they were trusting in. As Jesus himself pointed out in Mark 12:38, which we read a few weeks ago, these leaders like to walk around in long robes and like greetings in the marketplace and have the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at all the feasts. These guys were like kings, these religious leaders. They were known by every single person. People would see them and they would know by the way they dressed, by the people that followed them, that they were something. And they loved the attention. They loved the notoriety. And now Jesus is coming in and he is threatening that. He is kicking the legs out from underneath them. And now others were claiming that Jesus is the coming king of the kingdom of God. He is the King of kings, the Lord of lords. And the people start following them, and the religious leaders, they hate it. And they begin to wonder about their future, and they begin to become hopeless. You see, anytime your security, anytime your own identity is bound up in something that can be taken away, like your job, or your retirement account, or your spouse, or your significant other, or your looks, right, or your health. If your security, if your identity is invested in those people, in those things, and all of a sudden it looks like you could lose those things, what does it do in us? It creates a fear in us, a panic, because your hope for the future is in upheaval, right? It's uncertain. You can't assume that you can always rely on these things. It's trusting in something that's not certain, not guaranteed. Now, hope, when we think about the word hope, what is hope? Hope is really just what you believe about the future. It's what you're what you're thinking the future is going to be, what you're looking forward to in the future. And an absence of hope is what? It really creates a fear in us. When we don't have hope, it creates hopelessness, but it also creates fear. And here, the future for these guys, the hope for these guys, these religious leaders, was looking bleak unless they could get rid of Jesus. And so now they're desperate. They are desperately fearful. You see in verse 55 and 56 that they start interviewing prospective witnesses, hoping to have something on Jesus from these witnesses. And the witnesses line up. Anything they can find to justify execution, they'll take. And they can't find any, our text tells us. They can't find any because Jesus was innocent. Jesus was sinless. Jesus hadn't done a thing, and they could find no witnesses. And all the witnesses that they begin to gin up are verse 57 tells us, lying badly. They're lying so bad, or in verse 58 says that they're confused. In verse 59, none of their stories even match up. They can't even corroborate. They start talking about the same story, the same lie, and they can't even agree on the details of their lie. And so in verse 60, the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" He is so frustrated, this high priest, right? This high priest, that he couldn't get any credible evidence for conviction. That he now, instead of being the judge, he turns into the prosecutor. He becomes the prosecutor of this trial, trying to get Jesus to incriminate himself. But Jesus, verse 61, remained silent and gave no answer. They're getting nowhere. It's well past midnight now. It's almost the morning, and this trial is still going on. Their rush to injustice is going to get exposed when the people show up and all of Jesus' followers see what's happening. So they're desperate. They've got to do something. So the high priest addresses Jesus. And he says, when he presses Jesus, verse 61, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And by saying Son of the Blessed here, they just couldn't say the Lord's name, Yahweh. They were so holy and righteous that they didn't want to say God's name, so they just called him the Son of the Blessed, which means God. Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? He's asking Jesus, are you the Christ? Are you the Anointed One? Are you the Messiah? Are you the Son of God? Now, if Jesus says yes, Jesus is going to get himself killed by the Roman authorities because there is no king other than Caesar. So if Jesus just says he's the Christ, they can get him to agree that, and some have already said that about him. He's already confessed that privately. If they can get him to say that, then the Romans will come in. No king but Caesar, they will kill him. They will execute him. Problem solved. But how does Jesus answer? He says, verse 62, "I am." But he doesn't leave it there. He says also, "And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Jesus doesn't just say, "I am." He goes straight to an Old Testament prophecy from Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 to 14, where the Son of Man is God himself. And he's coming back at the end of time. He's coming back in all his glory for all to see. And when Jesus said he comes in the clouds of heaven, he's not talking about, nice little puffy clouds. We don't have any today, but, the puffy little clouds with the water vapor coming down, and Jesus is going to come down with a bunch of angels, and delicately coming down, or even like storm clouds. Jesus is talking about the Shekinah glory cloud. This is the cloud of God's presence that Daniel was talking about here. This is a cloud to be afraid of. This is the cloud of judgment. This is the cloud where God led his people when they were in the Exodus out of Egypt. It's the cloud where it entered the inner place of the temple when God was there. It's the cloud that represents God himself in the presence of God. Jesus is saying he's God. He didn't just answer, "Yes, I'm the Messiah." He's calling himself God. And that's not going to get him executed under Roman law, but that will get him executed under the Jewish law. Well, he actually is God, of course, but they didn't believe it. They didn't see it. And as soon as the words came out of Jesus' mouth, there wasn't like some big pause. They didn't deliberate at all. Verse 63, the high priest tore his garments and said, "What further witness do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision?" And they all condemned him as deserving death. Right? They got it. They nailed Jesus. Couldn't have been a better hope. Couldn't have been a better hope for them. And the leaders can't contain themselves. It's no longer a trial. They actually go crazy. They go berserk. And they start, in verse 65, we see they start spitting on Jesus. These are the justices, right? They start spitting on Jesus. They humiliate him. They're sucker punching him. So sure of their victory and so deceived into thinking that they had secured their future, thinking that they had secured their power, thinking they had secured their authority in their institution. If they only knew. They were still hoping in a false hope. It could come out from underneath them again, and it would. While the religious leaders weren't the only ones with an unreliable hope for the future, one of Jesus' own disciples, Peter, the Apostle Peter, the great Peter on which the rock of the church, the rock on which the church stands, he had an unreliable hope for the future. He was acting in a false hope. Now, Peter's kind of a small-town guy. If you didn't know much about Peter, he's definitely a blue-collar fisherman. He comes from a very rural area, Galilee. He comes from a small town like I did. He's kind of a small-town hick like I was growing up. I'm a small-town guy, kind of from a region of bumpkins, all these Galileans. And Mark tells you that, verse 54, Peter had followed Jesus at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. And Peter was sitting with the guards, warming himself at the fire. Peter got close enough to see how this all worked out. He pulled up next to that fire, and he tried to blend in. He tried to blend in with the rest of the mob in the dark of the night, keeping a distance from Jesus. Well, if you know anything about Peter, Peter's kind of a cocky guy. Right? He's a self-made man, and he thought he could pull this thing off. Well, as Peter's sitting there, smugly watching it all play out, verse 66, one of the servant girls of the high priest came and seeing Peter warming himself. She looked at him and said, "You also were with the Nazarene Jesus." He kind of all cool and calm and in control. Verse 68, Peter denied it, saying, "I neither know or understand what you mean." And he went out the gateway and the rooster crowed. Right? Peter's got this. He's just going to move to a little bit of a different spot, right, to watch what's going on, a little bit closer to the gateway, just in case he needed to make a quick exit. And so over at Peter's new location, Peter gets found again by the same girl. And now, verse 69, Peter begins to say to the this girl, verse 69, began to say to the bystanders, who's the mob that brought him there, who brought Jesus there, this man is one of them. Right? She's calling Peter out. Right? No one wanted to be associated with Jesus. And Peter himself here does not want to be associated with Jesus. And so verse 70, we're told he denied it a second time. Well, a little while goes by, and verse 70, the bystanders said to Peter, "Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." Right? Peter's accent, his Galilean accent, gave him away. He's not a local Jerusalem boy. But Peter, once again, thinking, I got this, he, verse 71, began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, "I do not know this man of whom you speak." Right? This is the Peter who told Jesus just days ago, the Peter who told Jesus just days ago, said, "You are the Christ." Same Peter. And now he ridiculously says, "I don't know this man of whom you speak." I mean, seriously, everyone knew who Jesus was, especially the Galileans, but everyone knew who Jesus was. Thousands of people following, creating an uproar in the city. And Peter says, "I don't know him." And Peter binds his statement with an oath, swearing to God that he doesn't know Jesus. I mean, it's a desperate move to save himself using God out of fear of others. Come on over. For all Peter's talking about being pro-Jesus, pro-God, he really was just pro-Peter. He was all about himself. Peter found it easy to be self-dependent, right? No disciple we know is as outspoken as Peter. No one's as confident as Peter, always having to be the one who's going to get the best of anything and be the best at anything. Right? There's no obstacle too big for Peter to tackle. Remember, Peter's the guy that thought he could walk on water. He wanted to be the first one to get out there and walk on that water. And he did for a while. There's no obstacle too big. He was the guy who said, "I will never deny you, Jesus." All these other guys, these other 11 guys, he said, they're going to deny you. Not me, not Peter. I'm not going to deny you. And he was the only one that rebuked Jesus. When Jesus said he was going to have to go and die, he's like, no way, man, you're not going to do that. And then Jesus rebukes him, get behind me, Satan. Right? Peter's the kind of guy that doesn't need anybody else's help at all. He's the kind of person who likes to do it for himself and by himself. He even treats Jesus like sort of this supporting actor in his life story. You know, God's good to have around sometimes. Right? He's there to help me out when I need it. Maybe you can identify with that. Maybe you think that God's the supporting actor in your life story, that he's there to help you out. Like, I'm going to do my thing, and when I really need it, I'm going to pull in the big guy to help. But Peter was just using Jesus when it was convenient. When Jesus was clear to be around, Peter's all in. But when the heat gets turned up, this guy starts distancing himself from Jesus. When the social pressure is amped up, he distances himself from Jesus. And that's quite a warning to you and me, isn't it? It's easy to say you're all about Jesus on a Sunday morning when you're standing here among, a lot of Christians, when you're at church. But how about the rest of the week? How does your life look like the rest of the week? Does it look like you're associated with Jesus, or that you're standing a distance from Jesus? Well, Peter's about to get the legs knocked out from underneath him by Jesus. Yes, he's going to get the legs knocked out from underneath him by Jesus. Because as soon as Peter denies Jesus the third time, you read verse 72. The rooster crowed a second time, and Peter remembered how Jesus had said to him, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. Jesus just told Peter that that would happen. That same night, right before the mob picked Jesus up. And that's when self-dependent, self-made Peter said, no way, I will never deny you. And now Peter's self-confidence is knocked down because he's done the very thing Jesus said he would do that Peter said he would never do. He's knocked down and his hope in himself is destroyed. So destroyed, we read that, verse 72, Peter broke down and wept. He broke down and wept. His hope in the future that depended on himself is shattered. It's shattered. All that Peter was trusting in failed. His own strength now is no strength at all. And his hope is uncertain. And that's a sober warning to you and to me that your own strength is only as strong as you. Your own strength is only as strong as you, and that's not strong enough for hopelessness. That is not strong enough for hopelessness. People who lose a loved one, or who have cancer, or who have lost it all or are dying, they don't want to hear you tell them, just buck it up, just be strong, you've got this. They want real hope. They want a trustworthy hope, that no matter what happens, it's going to be okay. A real hope. They don't want platitudes. They don't want self-talk. Now, I'm not going to be a Debbie Downer. Who is Debbie anyway? I feel so bad for Debbie. But I don't want to be a Debbie Downer putting out any more hopelessness here. Because there's some really good news in this text for us this morning. Some real hope in our text. And it's a trustworthy hope for the future. And while Jesus is the one who held that kind of hope, and I know it may not look like it when I read the text for you this morning. I mean, he just got arrested. Jesus just got convicted. Right? He just got sentenced, and he's being taken away by the guards to the Romans to be executed. But did you notice the one person who wasn't freaking out, the one person who wasn't anxious or worried, who didn't even feel like he could lose it all, was Jesus? The only time Jesus speaks is to declare his identity. The words that got him killed, that was the only time he spoke in our passage. So what was his confidence? Where was his hope? Well, unlike the religious leaders, unlike the Apostle Peter, Jesus knew that even a perfect human like him couldn't succeed, couldn't have confidence and real hope apart from God the Father. Jesus was sentenced unjustly. He was spit on. He was mocked. He was despised. He was eventually killed on a cross. You know what? Jesus walked into that willingly. Jesus walked into all that with hope because he knew that God would not fail him. You see, God had a plan. You know something about God's plans? God's plans never, ever fail. Because God is sovereign, and what God says goes. And on top of that, God never breaks a promise. Think about that. You know anyone who will not break a promise? There's no one other than God. God will not break a promise. You can always count on God. And it's in that hope in God, and all that hope in God, that created joy within Jesus in the midst of this. Joy in the midst of it. Hebrews 12:2 says, "For the joy that was set before him, Jesus endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God." Jesus went to the cross out of joy. Imagine that. Jesus went to the cross out of joy because Jesus went in the power and strength of God. For what reason? To rescue you from hopelessness. That's the joy that Jesus had, that he could rescue you from your hopelessness. You see, you and I are hopeless before God. We have offended God. We have rebelled against God and sinned. And that is really just turning to make ourselves God instead of him. We have turned away from God, making ourselves God. And Jesus gave his life on the cross to rescue you from that sin, and to give you hope. And not just a hope for today and right now, but a hope that goes beyond the grave. A hope that is realized upon death and in the presence of God. No other hope can do that. No other hope can survive death. None. You see, Jesus knew God would raise him from the dead. That was God's plan for you, and Jesus willingly came to fulfill, to the testimony of all history, to the testimony of thousands of witnesses, credible witnesses. And right now, just as he told the religious leaders, Jesus is sitting at the right hand of God. Right now, today. And one day, he promised, in all his glory, coming down in the cloud, he'll return to judge those who reject him and restore those who receive him. That is a trustworthy hope for your future. That is a certain hope that'll never let you down. That is a hope worth living and dying for. One that doesn't depend on your power. One that doesn't depend on your strength or ability, but on God, on Christ, and what he's accomplished for you. It's a hope that's based on a past event, Jesus' life, Jesus' death, Jesus' resurrection, and God's trustworthy promise of a hope to be realized in his return. Your confidence in the future affects how you live in the present. Your confidence in the future affects how you live in the present. As much as Peter was filled with weakness, it was in that weakness that Peter found hope. You see, when Peter broke down and wept, that was probably the point of his conversion. That was probably the point of his surrender to Jesus. His whole hope for the future changed in that moment, and so did how Peter lived. From here on, you read of Peter, and history testifies that when you read of Peter, you're going to see that he's ready, and he's willing, and he's joyfully ready to live for Christ, to live in his hope, to die identifying with and proclaiming Jesus Christ. He couldn't be near enough to Jesus. Peter's strength, his hope was in Jesus, a hope that carried himself to the grave, dying for him. You see, Peter himself was crucified for telling others where to find hope in Jesus. That's the difference Jesus makes in your life. Peter was a transformed man, and Jesus right now stands making you that same offer of transformation today. There's so much you and I don't know about tomorrow. This world has no promises. Cancer, coronavirus, fires, hurricanes. It has no certainty except death. So what are you hoping in? What are you trusting in. Don't put your confidence in a future that's hopeless. Don't live in fear. Don't trust in that which will fail, that which will disappoint. Don't live in a false hope, but put your hope in a Savior who loved you so much, he died for you and will deliver you into eternal life. So you can live now with a lasting joy and a peace that will get you through the uncertainty. It will get you through the hopelessness of this world and the strength and the power and the security of a sovereign God. A God whose strength will not wear out like yours and whose power is made perfect in all your weakness. No enemy, no adversity is too much when Jesus is your anchor and your foundation, not even death. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, all our hope is in you. Our future is in your hands, and yet if we fail to receive in faith that hope, we will be lost in uncertainty. And whatever we're trusting in will fail on or before that final day. God, I pray that you would open our eyes to see our helplessness, our hopelessness without you, our weakness, the need of your strength, our need of Jesus. God, open our eyes to see, our ears, hear, hearts, receive. We pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen. As Jesus joyfully and willingly gave himself to us, we now give tithes and offerings to his will.